The sky above Earth had turned dark with alien ships and Admiral Chun. Wei stood in the underground command center, watching everything fall apart on the holographic screens in front of her. 17 massive warships hung in orbit above the planet, and each one was bigger than any city on Earth, and they had weapons that could turn mountains into dust with a single shot. The Vethkai had come without warning 3 weeks ago, and humanity had fought back with everything they had, but it was not enough, and it was never going to be enough. "Admiral, we have lost contact with the Pacific Defense Grid," said Lieutenant Park from his station, and his voice was tired and hollow like a man who had not slept in days. Chun nodded slowly and marked another red zone on the map, and there were so many red zones now, and so few blue ones left. The aliens had given humanity a simple choice, and that choice was surrender or die, and they had given Earth 72 hours to decide, and those hours were almost gone now. "How many ships do we have left in orbit?" Chun asked, even though she already knew the answer. "None, Admiral," Park replied. "The Defiance was destroyed 2 hours ago, and the Armstrong went down fighting near the moon, and we have nothing left up there." Chun closed her eyes for a moment and thought about her daughter, who was somewhere in the shelters beneath New Beijing, and she thought about all the children in all the shelters across the world waiting to find out if they would live or die. The first contact with alien life had been the greatest moment in human history, and it had lasted exactly 14 minutes before the shooting started. The Vethkai did not want to talk, and they did not want to trade. And they did not want peace, and they wanted Earth, because apparently this planet belonged to them, and they had claimed it. 3,000 years before humans even learned to write. It did not matter that humans had built cities here and raised families here and dreamed their dreams here, and none of that mattered to the Vethkai, because humans were just pests living in a house that belonged to someone else. "Admiral," another officer called out, "General Morrison is requesting permission to launch the remaining nuclear arsenal at the enemy fleet." Chun shook her head slowly because they had already tried that, and the alien shields had stopped every missile, like they were nothing more than raindrops hitting a window. "Tell him to hold," she said. "We need those weapons for ground defense when they land their troops." And they would land troops soon, and everyone knew it, and the Vethkai would come down from the sky, and they would sweep across the Earth, and they would kill anyone who resisted, and that would be the end of humanity. But humans are strange creatures, and even when they know they cannot win, they keep fighting anyway. In the ruins of Tokyo, a young soldier named Kenji held his position even though half his squad was gone, and he kept firing at the alien fighters that screamed overhead, because giving up was not something he knew how to do. In the burning streets of Lagos, a grandmother named Adaze led a group of children through the wreckage to safety, and she carried the smallest one on her back, even though her legs were shaking with exhaustion in the mountains of Colorado. A group of teenagers worked to repair a damaged radio tower so that people could still communicate and still organize and still hope. All across the world, humans were doing what humans do, and they were fighting and helping and refusing to give up, even when giving up was the only logical choice. Admiral Chun watched all of this on her screens, and she felt something strange in her chest, and it was pride mixed with sorrow, because she was so proud of her species, and so sad that it would all end here. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Park said suddenly, and there was something different in his voice now, and it was confusion mixed with fear. "We are detecting something strange at the edge of the solar system." Chun turned to look at his screen, and her eyes went wide. Far beyond Pluto and far beyond the Kuiper Belt, in the cold dark space, where even sunlight was just a distant memory, something was happening. "What is that?" she whispered. "I have no idea, Admiral," Park replied. "It is massive, and it just appeared out of nowhere, and our sensors cannot make sense of the readings." On the screen, a shape was forming. And it was not a Vethkai ship, because Chun had memorized every type of enemy vessel, and this was something else entirely. It was huge and dark, and it seemed to bend the light around it in ways that should not be possible and along its surface. Patterns of light were moving in sequences that made Chun's eyes hurt when she tried to follow them. "Is it another invasion fleet?" someone asked, and the fear in the room was thick enough to taste. "No," Chun said slowly. "The Vethkai ships look nothing like that, and besides they already have more than enough firepower to destroy us 10 times over, so why would they need reinforcements?" The unknown ship was moving now, and it was moving fast, and it was heading toward Earth in her 17 years of military service. Chen had faced many enemies, and she had known fear many times. But this was different because this was fear of the completely unknown. "Try to contact it," she ordered. "All frequencies in all languages and everything we have us." The communications officer worked frantically at his station and sent message after message into the void, but there was no response from the mysterious vessel. Meanwhile, the Vethkai fleet had noticed the newcomer too, and Chun watched on the tactical display as the alien warships began to shift their formation, and they were no longer focused entirely on Earth, because now there was something else in the sky that demanded their attention. "The enemy fleet is powering up weapons," Park reported. "They are targeting the unknown ship." Chun held her breath and watched, and waited because there was nothing else she could do. The Vethkai opened fire and beams of terrible energy lanced across space toward the mysterious vessel. And Chun expected to see the strange ship torn apart because nothing could survive that kind of firepower. But the beams hit the dark hull and simply vanished like water poured onto hot sand, and the unknown ship kept coming, and it did not slow down, and it did not turn away. "Impossible," Park breathed. And in that moment, for the first time in 3 weeks, Admiral Shen Wei felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. She felt hope. The being that called itself the Sentinel had been sleeping for 50,000 years, and now it was finally awake. It was not alive in the way humans understand life, and it was not a machine in the way humans understand machines, and it was something in between and something beyond both. The architects had built the Sentinel long ago, when the galaxy was young, and they had given it a purpose, and that purpose was simple, and that purpose was everything. Watch and wait, and when the time comes, make a choice. The architects were gone now, and they had been gone for so long that even their ruins had turned to dust, and even the dust had blown away on the stellar winds, and nothing remained of them except the Sentinel and its mission. The great ship moved through space at speeds that would have seemed like magic to humans, and inside the ship the Sentinel thought its ancient thoughts and remembered its long, long history. It had watched Earth for 50,000 years, and it had seen so much. It had watched the ice come and go, and it had watched the great beasts rise and fall, and it had watched the small, clever creatures with their curious hands start to change the world around them. The Sentinel had watched humans paint pictures on cave walls, and it had wondered what they were trying to say. It had watched them build villages, and then towns, and then cities, and it had seen them learn to farm and to write and to count the stars in the sky. It had watched them make war on each other, and it had watched them make peace, and it had watched them fall and rise again over and over throughout the long centuries. Sentinel had observed many species across the galaxy, and most of them had disappointed it in the end. Some species reached for the stars with greed in their hearts, and they wanted only to take and to conquer and to own. Some species reached for the stars with fear in their hearts, and they wanted only to hide and to protect and to survive. Some species never reached for the stars at all, and they stayed on their little worlds, and they never grew, and they never changed, and eventually they faded away. But humans were different, and the Sentinel had known this for a long time. Humans reached for the stars with wonder in their hearts, and they wanted to know and to learn and to understand, and they wanted to find others out there in the darkness and say, hello. The Sentinel had listened to their radio signals for almost a century now, and it had heard their music and their stories and their arguments and their dreams, had heard them broadcast mathematics into the void, hoping someone would answer it, had heard them send messages of peace and friendship to stars they would never visit, had heard them ask again and again, is anyone out there, and we want to meet you, and we want to be your friend. And now the Vethkai had come to destroy them. The bees. Sentinel knew the Vethkai well because it had watched them too for thousands of years. And it knew what they were and what they wanted. The Vethkai were conquerors, and they had always been conquerors, and they would always be conquerors, because that was all they knew how to be. They had spread across 400 worlds, and they had crushed every species that stood in their way, and they had never lost a war because they were strong, and they were ruthless, and they were patient, but they had stopped growing long ago, and the Sentinel knew this too. Vethkai did not create anymore, and they did not dream anymore, and they did not wonder anymore, and they only conquered and controlled and consumed. They were like a fire that had burned so long it had forgotten why it was burning in the first place. The Sentinel ran calculations as it flew toward Earth, and those calculations would have taken human computers thousands of years to complete. But that Sentinel finished them in moments. It analyzed the Vethkai fleet and found their weaknesses, and they had many weaknesses because they had become arrogant, and they had not faced a real challenge in centuries. It analyzed the human defenses and found their desperation and their courage and their refusal to surrender even when surrender was the only logical choice. It analyzed a million different outcomes and a million different futures, and it made its decision. The Sentinel had been built to find those worthy of inheriting what the architects had left behind, and for 50,000 years it had searched, and for 50,000 years it had been disappointed. But not today. Today the Sentinel had found what it was looking for, and it had found it on a small blue world in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. Humans were not perfect, and the Sentinel did not want them to be perfect, because the architects had been perfect, and perfection had destroyed them in the end. Humans were flawed and messy and contradictory, and they fought each other, and they hurt each other, and they made the same mistakes over and over again, but they also loved each other, and they helped each other, and they dreamed of better things, and they never stopped trying to reach them. And when the darkness came for them, they did not run, and they did not beg, and they did not give up. They stood and they fought, even though they knew they could not win. The Sentinel had watched 1,000 species face extinction, and most of them had accepted their fate with quiet despair or desperate pleading, but not the humans, and never the humans. A human soldier would hold a position until the last breath left their body, not because they thought they could win, but because they could not bear to do anything else. A human mother would put herself between her children and danger without hesitation, knowing it would mean her death. Human scientists would keep working on a solution until the very last moment, hoping against hope that something could still be done. This was what the architects had been looking for, and this was what the Sentinel had been built to find. Not power and not wisdom and not technology, just the simple, stubborn refusal to surrender when surrender would be easier. Just the basic human belief that tomorrow could be better than today, if only they kept fighting for it. The Sentinel reached Earth orbit, and the Vethkai fleet turned to face it, and the ancient ship that had been sleeping for 50,000 years, prepared to do what it had been built to do it, prepared to fight for those who deserved a chance to live. Colonel James Okonkwo was crouched behind a broken wall in what used to be Geneva when the sky suddenly changed, and he thought for a moment that he had finally lost his mind. He had been fighting for 3 days without sleep, and he had watched good soldiers die all around him, and he had killed more alien warriors than he could count, and none of it had made any difference. The Vethkai kept coming, and they always kept coming, and for every one that fell, 10 more took its place, and James knew that this was the end. But then something appeared in the sky, and it was not a Vethkai ship. James had memorized every type of enemy vessel because knowing Your enemy was the first rule of war, and this thing above him was nothing he had ever seen before. It was massive and dark, and it seemed to twist the light around it in ways that made his head hurt, and along its surface strange patterns moved and pulsed like a heartbeat made of light. "What the hell is that?" whispered Private Santos from behind another piece of rubble. "I have no idea," James replied, and he realized that the Vethkai had stopped shooting. All across the battlefield, the alien warriors had frozen in place, and they were looking up at the sky too, and for the first time since the invasion began, James saw something in their body language that looked like fear. The giant ships in orbit were moving, and they were turning away from Earth and pointing their weapons at the newcomer instead. And then a voice spoke. It came from everywhere at once, and it seemed to bypass his ears entirely and speak directly into his mind. And James knew that every person on Earth was hearing the same words at the same moment. "I am the Sentinel," the voice said, and it was deep and old and powerful beyond anything James had ever heard. "I have watched this world for longer than your civilizations have existed, and the architects who built me are gone, but their purpose remains, and I was created to find those worthy of inheriting the stars." James felt tears running down his face, and he did not know why, and he could not have stopped them if he tried. "Today I make my choice." The ancient ship opened somehow, and James could not understand what he was seeing because parts of it seemed to unfold in directions that should not exist, and light poured out from within. And it was golden and warm, and it washed across the sky like a sunrise. The light passed through the Vethkai fleet, and where it touched their ships, things began to change. James watched the tactical display on his cracked helmet visor, and he saw the enemy vessels going dark one by one, and their weapons powered down, and their engines sputtered and died, and the mighty invasion fleet hung helpless. In orbit, the hegemony conquers through fear. The Sentinel continued. They destroy what they cannot control, but humanity chose to stand even when standing meant death, and this is rare, and this is precious, and this is worth protecting. On the ground, the Vethkai warriors were retreating, and they were running back to their landing craft, and they were no longer the terrifying conquerors who had slaughtered their way across the Earth. They were afraid. "I offer you one chance, hegemony," the Sentinel said, and there was something cold in its voice now, and something ancient, and something terrible. "Leave this system or learn what the architects could do when they chose war." For a long moment nothing happened, and the universe seemed to hold its breath. Then one of the Vethkai dreadnoughts began to move, and it was trying to break away from the fleet, and James saw its engines flare as it attempted to escape. The Sentinel responded instantly, and a beam of light shot from the ancient ship, and it struck the fleeing dreadnought, and the massive warship simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, and there was no debris, and there was no fire. One moment the ship was there, and the next moment it was gone, like it never existed at all. 16 remain, the Sentinel said calmly. "Leave now and tell your masters what you witnessed here, and tell them this system is protected, and tell them that if they return, I will not be so merciful." James watched the remaining Vethkai ships, and he could almost feel their terror through the cold vacuum of space. They had conquered 400 worlds, and they had never lost a battle, and they had never faced anything like this. The flagship of the fleet began to turn away from Earth, and one by one the other dreadnoughts followed, and they were running, and the mighty hegemony was running from a single ancient ship that should not exist. On the ground, the Vethkai warriors abandoned their positions and fled too. Their transports and the transports rose into the sky and raced toward the retreating fleet all across Earth. Humans watched the impossible happen, and they watched their enemy flee, and they watched salvation come from the stars. In Tokyo, Kenji lowered his weapon and stared at the sky with tears streaming down his face. In Lagos, Ades held the children close and whispered prayers of thanks to whatever power had saved them. In Colorado, the teenagers stopped their work and hugged each Other and laughed and cried at the same time in the Geneva Command Center. Admiral Chun Wei sat down heavily in her chair and put her head in her hands and let herself feel everything she had been holding back for 3 weeks. And Colonel James Okonkwo stood in the ruins of the battlefield and looked up at the ancient ship that hung in the sky like a dark angel. "Thank you," he whispered, even though he knew the sentinel probably could not hear him. But maybe it could, because the strange patterns on the ship's hull seemed to pulse once, almost like a response, and James felt something in his heart that he had thought was dead. He felt hope for the future, and he felt pride in his species, and he felt wonder at the vast and mysterious universe humanity had survived, and they had survived because something out there in the darkness had decided they were worth saving, and that changed everything. The HFY Warmind was a being of pure logic and cold calculation, and it had commanded the invasion fleet with perfect efficiency for 3 weeks, and it had never doubted victory for even a single moment. But now the Warmind was experiencing something it had never felt before, and that something was fear. The unknown ship hung in space between the retreating hegemony fleet and the planet Earth, and it had destroyed a dreadnought with a single shot, and it had disabled the entire invasion force with a wave of light that should not exist. The Warmind ran calculations and simulations and probability analyses, and every single one of them came to the same conclusion: the hegemony could not win this fight. You cannot interfere. The Warmind transmitted to the ancient vessel, and its voice was calm because it would not let its fear show. This world belongs to the hegemony by right of prior claim, and your actions violate the accords of galactic law, and you have no authority here. The response came immediately, and the sentinel's voice was patient like a teacher, speaking to a very slow student. Your accords mean nothing to me, and I existed before your ancestors dreamed of stars, and I watched the species who wrote those laws rise and fall while this planet's inhabitants were still learning to walk upright. And you speak of rights, but I speak of choices. The Warmind processed this information and did not like what it implied. The hegemony had records going back 12,000 years, and there was nothing in those records about the Sentinel or the architects who had built it, and that meant this entity was older than the hegemony itself, much older. "We will return with more ships," the Warmind said. "We will bring the full might of the hegemony, and we will destroy you, and we will take this world, as is our right." "You may try," the Sentinel replied, "but I should warn you that this vessel was built to fight wars on a scale you cannot imagine, and the architects faced enemies that would make your entire civilization look like children playing with sticks, and I was their final weapon, and I was never defeated." On Earth, humanity watched this conversation through every satellite and radio and screen that still functioned, and they held their breath and waited in the underground bunker in New Beijing. Admiral Chum's daughter clutched her mother's hand and watched the transmission with wide eyes. In a hospital in Berlin, a doctor paused in the middle of surgery to listen to the ancient voice speaking from the stars in a fishing village in Indonesia. An old man knelt on the beach and looked up at the sky and felt wonder for the first time since he was a child. The Warmind considered its options and found that it had very few. It could order the fleet to attack, and it knew with cold certainty that it would lose it. Could try to negotiate, and it knew that it had nothing to offer that the Sentinel might want it. Could retreat and report to the Fayest Hegemony High Command, and that was the only option that did not end in immediate destruction. "Why?" the Warmind asked finally. "Why do you protect these creatures, and what are they to you, and what do you gain from this interference?" The Sentinel was silent for a long moment, and when it spoke again, there was something different in its voice, and it almost sounded sad. "The architects built me to find those worthy of inheriting what they left behind, and for 50,000 years I have searched the galaxy, and for 50,000 years I have been disappointed." The ancient ship's lights pulsed slowly like a deep breath. "I have watched species rise and fall, and I have seen empires grow and crumble, and I have witnessed wonders and horrors. Beyond anything you could imagine, and through all of it, I waited and I watched and I hoped. The hegemony is strong, the Sentinel continued. You are efficient, and you are powerful, and you have conquered much, but you have stopped growing, and you have stopped wondering, and you have stopped reaching for anything beyond what you already have. Humanity is different, and they are young and they are weak, and they make so many mistakes, but they never stop trying, and they never stop dreaming, and they never stop reaching for something better. The war mind processed this and found it illogical. They are primitive, it said. They have barely left their own world, and they fight among themselves constantly, and they are not worthy of your protection. That is where you are wrong, the Sentinel replied. You measure worth by power and by conquest and by control, but those are not the things that matter, and those are not the things that last. I have seen powerful civilizations burn themselves out in a few thousand years, and I have seen weak ones endure for eons, and the difference is not strength, and the difference is not technology, and the difference is something much simpler. The difference is hope. Humanity hopes, and they hope when there is no reason to hope, and they hope when all logic says they should despair, and they hope when the darkness is closing in, and there is no way out. When your fleet arrived, they knew they could not win, and they knew they would probably die, and they fought anyway because they could not bear to give up on the future, even when the future seemed impossible. That is rare, and that is precious, and that is why I choose them. The war mind had no response to this because hope was not something it understood, and hope was not something the hegemony valued, and hope was just a word for foolishness in the face of reality. Leave now, the Sentinel said. Tell your masters that Earth is under my protection, and tell them that if any hegemony ship enters this system again, I will consider it an act of war, and I will respond accordingly. The hegemony will not forget this. The war mind replied, I am counting on it. The Sentinel said, now go. The war mind gave the order, and the fleet turned and fled, and they jumped to faster than light speed and vanished from the solar system, and humanity was saved. But as the Sentinel watched the enemy retreat, it knew that this was only the beginning. The hegemony would return someday, with more ships and more weapons and more determination, and when that day came, humanity would need to be ready. Sentinel had made its choice, and now it was time to help humanity become everything they could be. 3 weeks had passed since the Vethkai fled, and humanity was still trying to understand what had happened, and the world was slowly beginning to heal. Cities were being rebuilt, and refugees were returning home, and people were learning to look at the sky with wonder again, instead of fear. The Sentinel remained in orbit above Earth, and it answered no communications, and it made no demands, and it simply waited like a silent guardian watching over a sleeping child. Admiral Chen Wei had tried to contact the ancient ship every day since the battle, and every day there had been no response until today. Admiral Lieutenant Park said with surprise in his voice, the Sentinel is responding, and it wants to speak with you. Chun stood up from her chair so fast that it fell over behind her. Put it through, she said. The main screen flickered, and a voice filled the command center, and it was the same deep, ancient voice that had spoken during the battle. Admiral Chen Wei, the Sentinel, said, I have been watching you, and I believe you are the one I should speak with, and I am ready to answer your questions now. Chun took a deep breath and steadied herself. Can you bring me to your ship? She asked. The Sentinel replied, stand by. There was a flash of golden light, and Admiral Chun vanished from the command center and reappeared somewhere else entirely. She was standing in a vast chamber filled with soft light, and the walls seemed to flow like water frozen in mid-motion. And everything around her was beautiful in a way that made her heart ache. A figure stood before her, and it was humanoid, but not human, and its form shifted and changed constantly, like it could not decide what it wanted to be. I am the Sentinel, the figure said, or at least this is how I have chosen to appear to you. and my true form would be difficult for your mind to process. Chun nodded slowly and tried to appear calm even though her heart was racing. Why us? She asked, and this was the question that had been burning in her mind since the moment of salvation. We are not the most advanced species in the galaxy, and we are not the most peaceful, and we have done terrible things to each other throughout our history, so why did you choose us? The Sentinel's form flickered, and for a moment, Chun thought she saw something like a smile. You asked the right question, it said. Most species in your position would ask for technology, or for weapons, or for power. But you ask why. And that is exactly why I chose you. The figure began to walk, and Chun followed, and they moved through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. The architects who built me were the most advanced civilization the galaxy has ever known. The Sentinel said, they had technology that would seem like magic to you, and they had wisdom that took them millions of years to accumulate. And they were as close to perfect as any species has ever been. And perfection destroyed them. Chine frowned. In confusion, I do not understand, she said. The architects had no challenges left. The Sentinel explained. They had solved every problem and answered every question, and there was nothing left for them to reach for. And so they stopped growing. And when they stopped growing, they began to die. When their enemies came, they could not adapt because adaptation requires struggle. And they had forgotten how to struggle, and they fell in a single generation after lasting for millions of years. The Sentinel stopped walking and turned to face Chun. Before they died, they built me and they gave me one purpose, and that purpose was to find a species that would not make the same mistake. I have searched for 50,000 years, Admiral, and I have watched countless civilizations rise and fall, and most of them disappointed me in the end. Some were too aggressive, and they burned themselves out in wars of conquest, like your hegemony will someday. Some were too passive, and they let the universe happen to them instead of reaching out to shape it. Some were too proud, and they could not accept that there was anything left to learn. But humanity is different. The walls of the corridor became transparent, and Chun gasped as she saw the galaxy spread out below her in all its impossible beauty. You are flawed, the Sentinel said. You fight among yourselves, and you make the same mistakes over and over, and you hurt each other in ways that defy logic. But you also love each other with a fierceness that amazes me, and you help strangers at your own expense, and you create beauty, even in the darkest times, and you never ever stop reaching for something better. When the hegemony came, you knew you could not win, and you knew you would probably die, and you fought. Anyway, not because you thought you could defeat them, but because surrendering was simply not something you knew how to do. That is the quality the architects were looking for, Admiral, and that is the quality I was built to find, and that is why I chose humanity. Chum felt tears on her cheeks, and she did not try to hide them. What happens now? She asked. Now you grow. The Sentinel replied, I will teach you what I know, and I will share with you the technology of the architects, and I will protect you while you are weak. But I will not do the work for you because that would defeat the purpose, and you must earn your place among the stars through your own effort and your own struggle. The hegemony will return someday, and when they do, you must be ready to face them on your own, because I cannot protect you forever. Chun straightened her shoulders and looked the ancient being in the eye, or in what passed for its eye. We will be ready, she said. I believe you, the Sentinel replied. And that is why I chose you, and that is why I have hoped for the first time in 50,000 years. The chamber's walls became even more transparent, and Earth appeared below them small and blue and beautiful. The architects left behind one final message for whoever would inherit their legacy, the Sentinel said. And I have carried that message for 50 millennia, waiting for the right moment to share it. What is the message? Chun asked. The Sentinel's form solidified for just a moment, and Chun saw something ancient and wise and kind looking back at her. "The message is this," the sentinel said. "The purpose of life is not to survive, and the purpose of life is not to conquer, and the purpose of life is to help others reach higher than you ever could." The architects lifted up the species that came before me, and those species lifted up the architects. And now I lift up humanity. And someday when you are ready, you will lift up others, and they will lift up others after them. And the chain will continue forever, reaching back through time and forward into eternity. That is the legacy of the architects, and that is the inheritance I offer you. Chun looked down at Earth and thought about her daughter and her daughter's children and all the generations yet to come. "We accept," she said. And far below on the scarred but healing Earth, humanity looked up at the stars, and for the first time they saw not darkness but possibility, not enemies but friends waiting to be found, not an ending but a beginning. Their future had just begun, and it stretched out before them, infinite and wonderful and full of hope. And the sentinel watched and smiled and knew that after 50,000 years of searching, it had finally found what it was looking for. Not a perfect species, but a worthy one. Not conquerors, but inheritors. Not an ending, but a new beginning for the galaxy itself. Humanity was ready to reach for the stars, and the stars were waiting to welcome them home.